This photo you see is from the real case of two guys who made millions of dollars by selling weapons to the United States government. Now, just over 20 years old, they're about to close the most important deal of their lives, only this time it will be illegal. Everything was going according to plan, but the unchecked ambition of one of them ruined it all. I'm not just talking about the business, but also their friendship. Before becoming millionaires, one of them, David Packouz, dropped out of college and now works as a massage therapist in Miami. He hates his job and feels completely lost, but he needs the money. Trying to build a better life for himself and his girlfriend, he embarks on a new venture, selling quality sheets wholesale to nursing homes in Florida. Unfortunately, this business doesn't go very well for him and his financial situation starts to get complicated. However, things change when he reconnects with his best friend from high school, Efraim Diveroli. Efraim wears a sharp suit, drives an expensive car, and looks amazing. Efraim invites him to spend the day together and David agrees. On the way, Efraim tells him that he had been working with his uncle selling weapons, but his uncle stole more than $70,000 from him. So he has returned to Miami to try to start his own business with everything he has learned. Efraim also really likes to smoke weed, so he goes to buy some. However, he gets scammed by a group of dealers who were there. They try to intimidate him, but Efraim grabs his rifle from the car and starts shooting into the air. And now, let's take our first pause here. The clips you're watching are from a movie called War Dogs, which is based on the real-life case of these two guys you see here. Although the movie tells the real story, it exaggerates some things to make it more dramatic, but a lot of it is actually true. For example, Efraim didn't fire guns in the street, but he was always a big fan of them. When he was a teenager, Efraim was sent to work at a pawn shop owned by his uncle, and like most pawn shops, there were guns, lots of guns. That's where Efraim fell in love with them. The pawn shop sold some guns to the local police, and they told his uncle that if he wanted to sell on a larger scale, he needed to participate in some kind of auctions for government contracts. So that's what they started doing. The problem was that he had a big fight with his uncle, which led him to strike out on his own and look for something to do by himself. For his part, David's story, the masseur, is actually true. He says that he worked as a masseur and also had other businesses like importing towels or sheets from foreign countries or other similar products to sell to nursing homes or retirement homes. Pay attention, because from now on I'll be telling you which things really happened and which ones are just exaggerations. In no time, the friends rekindle their friendship and discover that there's still good chemistry between them. One day, David visits Efraim at his office, which is actually just a small room. There, he tells him the details of his business. Efraim isn't just any arms dealer. His main client is the United States government. And he doesn't just sell them weapons, he sells them everything. Guns, bullets, security vests, helmets, and even gasoline. Anything the government needs, he can get it. David asks him how much he makes, and Efraim reveals that in just 8 weeks he has earned over $200,000. And it's not like Efraim owns big weapons factories or oil companies, far from it. What Efraim does is act as the middleman between the companies that have the product and the government. This is when Efraim explains to his friend how this works. What you're about to hear is 100% real, so pay attention. The United States government has a public website where they post all the calls for bids for military contracts. Basically, they announce what they need to buy, and then those who can supply it submit their bids to compete for the contract. The government reviews all the bids and chooses whoever can offer them the best deal at the lowest price and who has the best reputation. What Efraim does is look for the smaller contracts, the ones the big suppliers don't take. But even though they're small contracts, Efraim is becoming a millionaire in his early 20s thanks to the fact that, no matter how small they are, the US government spends an outrageous amount of money when it comes to war. This new company that Efraim founded, AEW Inc., gained more momentum around 2004, shortly after the invasion of Iraq. This was a historic moment for the U.S. war industry due to the immense amount of resources the government had to invest to maintain its military presence abroad. After the September 11, 2001 attacks and the subsequent declaration of the War on Terror, the invasion of Afghanistan and the later occupation of Iraq marked a turning point in U.S. military spending, which reached unprecedented levels. With these interventions, the Department of Defense's budget skyrocketed. In the case of Iraq, it was a war that required both the initial deployment of troops and the maintenance of a prolonged occupation, as well as the reconstruction of a devastated country. To achieve this, the United States needed large quantities of military equipment, weapons, ammunition, and basic supplies. Among the main demands were weapons, armored vehicles, logistical equipment, personal protective gear, among many other things. And here's something incredible. From these kinds of contracts, men like Robert Stevens, the CEO of a company specializing in building military weaponry called Lockheed Martin, became extremely wealthy by securing government contracts. I'm talking about in one of his best years, this man earned $31 million in bonuses or commissions. All of this is public information, and he never set foot on the battlefield. Another example of this is Stephen Ornstein, the owner of a company called Supreme Group, who won the contract to supply food to the U.S. troops. The problem was that they quickly realized the government was burning through money without really paying attention to where it was going. So he took advantage of this to start raising the prices of his food and carry out other types of fraudulent schemes, earning millions of dollars for himself and the company. And finally, another person who took advantage of this was Efraim, who was in the right place with the right knowledge at the right time. Now that you have the context, it's time to go back to the movie. One night, just like any other, David's girlfriend reveals to him that she's pregnant. David is excited, of course, but he's also very worried because he knows he doesn't have enough money to support a family. When he tells his friend about his situation, his friend doesn't hesitate to help him and offers him a job at the company, a proposal David accepts, though he lies to his wife since she is against the war and anything related to it. He simply tells her that his friend Efraim has government contacts who will help him sell his bedsheets. The problem is that when his wife finds out about the real business, the trust in this young couple will be shattered. Here are a couple of things in which the movie differs from what actually happened in real life. To begin with, David wasn't doing as badly financially as the movie portrays. Yes, he was indeed a massage therapist and sold his sheets, but in several interviews he says that in reality he wasn't doing so badly in this business and could afford a decent life. However, he wasn't making millions like his friend. Additionally, David says that he told his girlfriend about the business he was going to get involved in from the very beginning and she was okay with it. He himself, in an interview, mentions that his girlfriend wanted him to make money because nobody minds having more and because the baby on the way did have them a bit worried. In the movie, they made this a secret that David hides from his girlfriend. Basically, because the movie was designed to appeal to a mass audience and most of these stories are more engaging if there's a romantic drama involved, so they had to include that aspect. What is true, though, is their partnership in the business. After hearing him out, Efraim told him that many of the things David did could be applied to his arms business, logistics, organizing financing, searching for deals online, importing, and so on. He also needed someone he could trust in order to expand, so David was the ideal man for Efraim's mission, to become rich again no matter what it took. Just like their workspace, the terms of their agreement to work together were completely informal. Just a handshake, a detail that will become important later on. There were no contracts or paperwork involved, just a verbal agreement. Efraim offered David a percentage of the profits from the contracts he managed to secure. At first it was 50% and later on he would reduce it to 25%. David spends the next few weeks learning everything he can from Efraim, checking the government website day and night in search of the best contracts. While David checks the website, Efraim handles the calls to the suppliers. To grow the business, they bring in an investor, a man named Ralph Slutsky, who owns 14 dry cleaners scattered throughout Miami. Ralph finances the purchases, and in exchange they give him what he believes is 25% of the profits. Now that they have an investor, it's easier to land contracts for more money. While the friends are having dinner, David gets a call that reveals they've won a big and lucrative contract with Iraq for some Beretta pistols. They'll make hundreds of thousands of dollars if they can get all the weapons they've already promised. The first major problem arises because the Beretta pistols they acquired are made in Italy, and recently the European Union imposed an arms embargo that prohibits exporting military equipment to Iraq due to political tensions and concerns about stability in the region. This means that Italy, as a member of the European Union, cannot sell or ship these weapons directly to Iraq. Captain Santos, who is waiting for the pistols for his men, calls David to inform him about this new restriction. David, surprised and without an immediate plan, tries to stay calm and pretends he has everything under control, even though he really doesn't know how to solve the situation. He didn't even know about the embargo. David is very distressed because he doesn't know how they're going to get out of this. But Efraim has the solution: lie and say that everything is perfect. Efraim decides to send the pistols to Jordan, a neighboring country of Iraq, and then transport them by land to their final destination. This technical maneuver allows them to avoid the embargo since the pistols are not exported directly from Italy to Iraq but instead pass through an intermediate country. This method is clever, but it borders on illegality and shows how Efraim is willing to bend the rules to fulfill his contracts and make a profit. The execution of the plan begins and the Berettas leave Italy, but they end up being confiscated in Jordan where they remain and never reach Iraq. With nothing else to do, they decide to travel to Jordan to find a way to release their shipment. When they arrive, they realize they don't have the support of the U.S. Embassy. They're on their own in this. With no other options, they get in touch with some men who have connections with the Jordanian government. At first, they see the Americans with no compassion or mercy, but Efraim bribes them and the men start to help, though not in the way they had planned. What David and Efraim were hoping for was that they'd be given permission to transport the Berettas by plane, but the solution they're given is very different. Apparently, instead of a plane, the Berettas will travel by truck and they themselves will have to drive it, accompanied by the best smuggler in the entire Middle East. In other words, this man. The journey is a real odyssey. It's 800 kilometers from Jordan to Baghdad and it takes them a whole day on the road. They arrive at the border at night and find Iraqi soldiers blocking their entry. David and Efraim are scared, but they keep calm and fortunately manage to get through. After this, they make a stop at an abandoned gas station, but from a distance they see an armed group approaching to capture them. Our protagonist and the best smuggler flee in the car, and just when it seemed they were about to be hit by bullets, U.S. government helicopters appear to provide support. Despite everything, they arrive at the military base, and the soldiers and supervisors inspect the Berettas. Everything seems to be in order, so the captain sends them to receive their share of the deal. Before that, the young men take a photo to commemorate their biggest business deal so far. In the place where they get paid, there are millions and millions of dollars neatly stored, along with notebooks listing many more names of other contractors who have been paid for different deliveries. War can be many things, a way to defend oneself or a means to exalt democracy. All the reasons you've probably already heard. But another very important thing is that war is also a business. For example, more than 2 million soldiers fought in the war in the Middle East. Equipping just one of these soldiers cost around $17,500. With just this fact, you can imagine the fortune that lies behind the military industry. And not just on equipment, there are also records showing that the US government spent more than $4.5 billion annually just on air conditioning units for the soldiers. The soldiers congratulate our protagonists and are surprised that these two crossed the desert by land, since the area they went through is one of the most dangerous, known as the Triangle of Death. But how much of this is actually true? Well, in reality, David and Efraim were never in the Triangle of Death and never found themselves in any situation where their lives were in danger during a deal. Most of their deals and business could be closed from the comfort of their office. And while it's true that these kinds of problems often came up, like embargos or bureaucratic issues, they were things that could be solved by fax, phone calls, or by sending someone else to handle the matter. For now, everything is going wonderfully in their lives and in the business. Both have become rich. But everything changes on July 28, 2006, when they see that a new contract has been posted on the website. At first glance, it looks like any other contract, but in reality, it's very different from the rest. This contract is for Afghanistan and requires an enormous amount of military equipment, enough to arm the Afghan army for 30 years. A contract that, if they win, will make them millionaires. To understand the magnitude of this opportunity, it's important to have some context. This contract wasn't for weapons, but for ammunition. The contract included about 30 different types of items, ranging from pistol ammunition to tank rounds and anti-aircraft rockets. The numbers were truly impressive. It was estimated that approximately 150 million rounds were needed for the AK-47. All this material was intended for the Afghan National Army, a military force created and supported by the United States to maintain stability in Afghanistan and fight the Taliban. After the attacks the United States invaded Afghanistan with the goal of overthrowing the Taliban regime that had given refuge to Al-Qaeda. After the rapid defeat of the Taliban, a democratic government was established with the support of the United States and the international community. Hamid Karzai assumed the presidency in 2004, but the situation in the country remained unstable due to the Taliban insurgency, which regrouped and continued launching attacks against Afghan and international forces. In 2006, the George Bush administration was facing growing unpopularity due to the prolonged wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. They anticipated that the next president could be a Democrat and assumed that a Democratic administration might prioritize the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. This concern led the Bush administration to arm the Afghan army to the teeth in order to sustain its fight against the Taliban for many more years. However, there's a problem. This operation can't be carried out openly without attracting public and political scrutiny within the country. The solution is to outsource the process through private contractors who take care of the dirty work. This is where David and Efraim come in, two young men who see in this contract a unique opportunity to make history and, above all, a lot of money. It will be difficult to get everything the government is asking for, but the world's largest arms trade convention, Eurosatory, is coming up soon. They know that there they can find the contacts they need. At the convention, they meet one of the most powerful men in the arms business, Heinrich Thomet, who has contacts all over Europe, although he has a problem. After getting into conflicts with the US government, they can't sell directly to the American country, so the man offers our protagonists a deal. Thomet helps them with the contacts, and David and Efraim help him sell in America. It's a win-win. Even though it seems like the perfect solution, David isn't sure, since the problems Thomet got into landed him on the terrorist list. However, Efraim tells him the following: "This is our job, to do business with people the government can't negotiate with directly." Efraim puts it in a cynical but accurate way. Their job is to deal with those whom the government can't officially work with, but from whom in some way it still needs resources. One of the fundamental aspects of this competitive system is what the government has. Thomet tells them that he can get them the entire order. There won't be any problem with the logistics. The key, he says, is Albania, a country that was very important during the Cold War and whose warehouses are filled with military equipment. And when I say filled, I mean literally packed with all kinds of weapons, explosives, and ammunition. But let's see, why would a country like Albania have all this? The answer takes us to a combination of geopolitical history and the arms trade movements after the Cold War. In this case, Efraim and David managed to supply themselves from Albania through a Swiss arms dealer with excellent contacts in the Balkans. This man, Heinrich Thomet, had key connections, including the son of the Albanian prime minister, which made the deal easier. In the movie, this is the character we just saw played by Bradley Cooper under the name Henry. Now, to understand why Albania has all this, we need to know its particular history. During the Cold War, it was ruled by a dictator named Enver Hoxha, who distrusted both the Soviet Union and NATO. He considered that the Soviets were not true communists and feared they would invade him, as they had done with Czechoslovakia. At the same time, he thought that NATO could also attack them because of their communist alignment. And believing that his small and impoverished country was in the crosshairs of both superpowers, Hoxha sought protection by allying with China, which at that time was delighted to have an ally in Europe. China began sending enormous quantities of weapons and ammunition to Albania, while Hoxha built a vast network of bunkers to prepare his nation for total war. His plan was to turn every man, woman, and child into soldiers willing to fight to the death. But the war he so greatly feared never came. And when the Cold War ended, Albania was left with a massive surplus of weapons and ammunition stored in those bunkers. Time passed, the Albanian economy collapsed, and between 2006 and 2007 Albania was trying to join NATO. But one of the conditions was to get rid of Soviet-era munitions, so instead of paying for their dismantling, the Albanian government decided to sell them at low prices to save on costs and generate income. It was here that Heinrich Tomet managed to strike an incredible deal, organizing the sale of these munitions for David and Efraim. However, there is a very important detail. The contract with the United States Army stipulated that under no circumstances could Chinese munitions be delivered. This was due to the embargo imposed in 1989 after the Tiananmen Square massacre, when the Chinese government brutally suppressed students who were peacefully protesting for democracy. This embargo prohibited U.S. citizens and companies from buying or selling any military items related to China. Although the munitions in Albania were technically legal since they had been purchased before the embargo and were already outside of China's direct control, Ephraim's contract was explicit. Munitions of Chinese origin were not allowed regardless of the circumstances. This was a critical problem because many of the bullets stored in Albania had originally been manufactured in China. Unfortunately, the protagonists were not well informed about the situation, or at least about the fine print, so they went ahead with the deal without knowing they were buying something they were legally prohibited from using. Now, in the movie, the guys traveled to Albania to inspect the merchandise and even show how they test its quality by firing the rifles. But this didn't actually happen in real life. Efraim and David practically never visited Albania, and they didn't go themselves to inspect the merchandise. What really happened is much more boring. Our protagonists spent hours and hours making call after call to make sure all the contacts Tomet had given them were legitimate. Finally, Efraim decides to make his offer to the government for the modest sum of $298 million, from which, if accepted, he would keep 10% of the profits. Once they send the offer, all they can do is wait. After 5 months, they receive the news. They landed the Afghan contract, news that would change their lives, though not for the better, as this would mark the beginning of the end for the company and their lives as free men. The young men can't believe it. They're barely in their early 20s and they're doing business with the United States government, which is about to make them ultra-millionaires. But anyway, now they really get to work. The thing is, in real life, things were much more complicated than this. In interviews conducted sometime after the events, David says that by this point, his relationship with Efraim was already very fractured. He claims that he wasn't a good and honest man, and that in any business he did, he always tried to get the most out of it, even if it meant breaking verbal agreements or doing whatever it took to squeeze out a few extra dollars. This aggressive style led Efraim to reinvest David's profits without even consulting him. So no matter how many millions they were making, David had to live off his savings, since all the money was being reinvested without his full consent. But before they could start, the government had to audit their company to make sure everything was in order. The problem was that A&Y had no bank records, so they had to fabricate 3 years of balance sheets, bank statements, and purchase orders for the company, or in other words, commit fraud, something that was 100% true in real life. Up until now, nothing they had done was entirely illegal, but with this, they've started to get involved in much shadier business. Additionally, the audit includes an interview with the Pentagon. The pair are very nervous, so much so that they even smoke a little weed to calm their nerves before going in. The agents receive them, and in the end, everything goes well. Now they have a clear path to those millions in profits. Of course, they just have to make sure the goods arrive in Afghanistan on time and in proper condition. Tensions between the friends rise because Efraim starts to become very impulsive, which makes David realize the trouble he's gotten himself into. He doesn't even have a contract to protect himself, so he writes one up and asks Efraim to sign it. His partner does sign it, although it's clear he doesn't want to. And even though David was smart enough to have him sign the contract, he didn't make a single copy of it, something that will cause him a lot of trouble in the future. In real life, this contract never existed. Everything was based on verbal agreements because at first they fully trusted each other, something that would have serious consequences for poor David. Although this scene didn't happen exactly like this in real life, David actually did realize too late the danger he was in, but he says that when he tried to fix things and renegotiate, Efraim showed his worst side. He didn't care about their words or the respect they had as friends and tried to take away all of David's share in the deals he had closed. On top of that, he threatened not to pay him the money he owed him. But right now they have bigger problems. They need to focus on the Afghan contract. While in the movie it's David who goes to Albania to supervise the shipment, in reality it was Podriski, a friend who had recently joined the company, who went. As soon as Podriski arrives in Albania, the signs that something is wrong begin. The ammunition was packed in containers covered with Chinese characters. This means that the ammunition comes from China, which is terrible because remember, the contract with the Pentagon specifically prohibits products from this country. The deadline is approaching, and any delay in fulfilling their part of the deal means they will lose the contract. With nothing else to do, the pair takes the riskiest option because they don't have time to find another one. Efraim gives Podrisky instructions to repackage the ammunition in containers that don't have Chinese writing to make them look like they were manufactured elsewhere. An action that is now completely illegal since it counts as fraud. Now they have a plan, but who would be willing to deceive the United States in this way? Well, the answer lies with a man named Costa Trevica, a local box manufacturer. When they tell him what they need to repackage millions of rounds of ammunition, Costa knows something strange is going on, but since the pay sounds good, he accepts the offer. Costa calculates how much the packaging process will cost and tells David and Efraim that he will charge them a total of $100,000 for the boxes and labor. This is incredible news. With the new packaging, the ammunition is much lighter, so it costs much less to transport. And when they do the math, it turns out that what they save on transportation is almost $3 million. Costa's men get to work and set up packaging lines. But by then, a new problem has arisen. Efraim doesn't trust Tomit, the man who helped them get the ammunition. He thinks they're being scammed and orders his people to get to the bottom of it. With this investigation, Efraim discovers that the Albanian government sells the ammunition to Tomit for 2 cents and he sells it to Efraim for 4. In other words, he's doubling his money without doing much. Efraim's violent and aggressive personality makes him furious and he kicks Tomit out of the operation. He doesn't know it yet, but this will cost him dearly. Efraim orders his men in Albania to get in touch with the government to buy the ammunition directly from them, cutting Tomit out of the deal, a move that will go terribly wrong for him. It turns out that Tomit was using the extra money to ensure the silence of the Albanian government, which is why he was selling the product at double the price. Tomit is untouchable, and by order of the Albanian government, which works very closely with Tomit, Costa is removed from the operation. Now the government itself will take care of repackaging the ammunition. Costa is furious since he had already hired his repackaging staff for 8 weeks and now has to pay them in addition to having already invested in the boxes that were going to hold the new bullets. In the movie, we see how Costa tries again and again to negotiate for his overdue payments, but neither Efraim nor David pay any attention to him as they are worried about many other things. But in real life, after Costa is taken out of the game, he asks them if they could at least buy the boxes he had already invested in. However, David says that Ephraim's explosive and reckless personality leads him to refuse to buy the boxes from them. What it would have cost them to buy the boxes was insignificant compared to everything they could earn, but Efraim chose not to buy them. This is literally their death sentence, but in a moment you'll see why. Despite this, the ammunition manages to arrive safely in Afghanistan and the money is transferred to the Friends Company accounts. After all that work, they had achieved their dream. Finally, they're rich. Well, not exactly. Efraim is the one who controls the bank accounts, and even though he had already received the money, he still hasn't given David his share. This creates conflict, and David starts to suspect that his friend is about to betray him. And unfortunately, he's right. Efraim tells him that he wants to renegotiate their deal, something that can't possibly end well for David, because as you may recall, he doesn't even have a contract. The agreement between them was only verbal. There is no legal document that David can use to defend himself. In the movie, they portray this moment as one of the most dramatic, where Efraim takes advantage of David not being in the office to tear up the only copy of the contract. And when David tries to find it to defend himself, he discovers that the person who was once his best friend has betrayed him in the lowest way possible, something that didn't actually happen like that in real life. But seeing that paper being torn up adds a lot of drama and excitement to the story. The sense of helplessness is so great that David prefers to walk away from everything. We see how sometime later the man goes back to working as a masseur, but one bad day, the owner of the dry cleaners approaches him. He tells him that Efraim has sent him because he wants to negotiate with him to give him fair compensation for the years of service at his company. However, when the two meet face to face and Efraim makes his offer, David is outraged. He's offering him only $10,000 when David has generated hundreds of millions for that company. The problem is that during the meeting, a fight breaks out. The argument escalates and both of them exchange hurtful words. In the end, David storms out furious. What neither of them knows is that the police are already after them, and the first person they found was the owner of the dry cleaners, who decided to cooperate with the police in exchange for a reduced sentence. That's why he went to talk with Efraim and David, although the entire conversation was being recorded by the police. Days later, Efraim and David run into each other in an elevator where Efraim reveals his true self, fake, deceitful, and opportunistic. But when the elevator doors open and they're about to step out, the FBI is waiting outside and arrests them. The real reason they were caught wasn't because of all the lies they told the government or the illegal things they did. The reason they got caught, as unbelievable as it sounds, was because they didn't pay the man who helped them repackage the boxes. This man was so angry about these unfair practices that he decided to call the New York Times and tell them everything. That's how the police actually found them in real life. David is sentenced to 7 months of house arrest, and to this day he maintains that he and Efraim were used by the U.S. government as scapegoats. He says they were arrested not because of the illegality of their actions, but because they got caught. No government official was arrested, even though the emails clearly show that members of the Pentagon knew something was wrong with the ammunition. They simply decided to turn a blind eye because that was what suited them. For his part, Efraim was sentenced to 4 years, but his sentence was reduced when he agreed to cooperate with the investigation.